So as you said, my name's Neil Lee from the London School of Economics. I should say two sort of caveats before I start. And the first is that I'm British, and British people tend to speak too quickly. So if I speak too quickly, let me know. And the second caveat is that this is a slightly different piece of work because there's no econometrics, there's very few numbers. It's entirely policy focused. But it's a piece of work which has had a reasonably, well, it's done pretty well so far. So I'm very interested in your sort of views on it and your questions. And in particular, a lot of this has been inspired by policy agendas in the UK, the US, and the OECD. But I'm very interested in these agendas and how they apply to other parts of the world. So let me kick off with a bit of a justification. So inclusive growth has become, certainly in the UK, something of a mantra in economic geography, in urban policy. So what we've seen is we saw, quite some time ago, we saw a series of reports by organizations such as the World Bank, the ADB published a lot of work on the Asian Development Bank, published a lot of work on this area. And the idea that growth could be inclusive became increasingly important. And this has started off in the developing world, but it has increasingly filtered through into the developed world. And it's gone through, a series of changes. And the first change, which happened a little while ago, was that people started focusing on inclusive growth in cities. So we saw the OECD launched a program of research on inclusive growth. Soon this became the more focused on inclusive growth in cities. Of course, UN Habitat, part of the Habitat Agenda, they've had some work on inclusive growth. And what I'm very interested in is that these sort of two very different policy agendas, inclusive growth and then inclusive growth in cities, and often focusing in the developing world, have become increasingly important in the developed world and in the UK in particular. So we've had a few very significant moves, at least in UK policy. The Inclusive Growth Commission was launched by the Royal Society of the Arts. This was a very famous, a sort of reputable, learned society, and they launched a commission to see how growth could be made inclusive. Of course, the OECD Inclusive Growth in Cities agenda, and the Joseph Rowntree Foundation. So the Joseph Rowntree Foundation are they were founded by Quakers a long time ago, and they essentially come from the Rowntree's chocolate factory family, and they're an endowment which funds research. But you can see inclusive growth has been important with other organizations such as Rockefeller, the Ford Foundation. It's become something of a mantra in urban policy, certainly in the UK, if not elsewhere. And this, of course, as an academic, makes me question it. It makes me wonder whether this is absolutely the correct thing to be doing, and it makes me think that we should be critical about it. And my favorite sort of graphic for the critique comes from a very famous to us, but probably not famous to you guys, a TV show called The Thick of It, which was about politicians. And in it, they played a game where you have to put a word on your forehead. Everyone else can see what the word is, and you have to guess what it is. And this is a politician called Peter Mannion, a fictional politician called Peter Mannion, who finds it impossible to guess what inclusivity is. He can't work out what inclusivity is. And this, to me, expresses the sort of challenge we face amongst many of the sort of UK's policy circles, that we have a lot of people who are sort of critical of this notion of inclusive growth, but they haven't really thought about it. They're just knee-jerk critical of the idea of inclusivity. So what I'm trying to do in this presentation, or the paper in which this presentation is based on, is have a sort of a sympathetic critique of the idea of inclusive growth, not a knee-jerk one. And the framing is basically this. Inclusive growth has become a mantra for urban policy in the UK. You see it everywhere. Economic development consultants I work with, they now talk about the fact that they used to write economic development strategies, now they write inclusive growth strategies. And we can see inclusive growth it's not entirely new. You can see where it has come from. It's the latest attempt to reconcile this challenge of the need for efficiency with the desire for equity. And it's based around a concern, and there's two things which are really important in terms of the context. One, as I'll talk about later, is this notion that we need to be more concerned about inequality. In the crisis was 10 years ago tomorrow, I think, the Lehman Brothers collapsed. In the UK, it was 2007 when the sort of crisis became apparent. 10 years on, we're very concerned about inequality, which the crisis might have led to. But it's also interesting from an urban perspective, because much of what we're talking about in this area is essentially an attempt to reconcile this concern about inequality with the idea that cities are now seen as economically important actors. So a couple of years ago, I went to the cabinet office, or I went to number 10, basically. This is where the UK Prime Minister sits. And the thing they were really interested in was the idea that cities could be the drivers of growth. And my friend took me through number 10, or he took me through the cabinet office into number 10. And he said, we went through one room and there was a corridor. And he said, you see this room here? This is where Winston Churchill sat out the Blitz. So we walked a little bit further and he showed me a sort of patch of wall and he said, that used to be Henry VIII's tennis court. And we walked through a little bit more and we went into this room and it was a sort of wood paneled room with a big table in the middle. And this civil servant said, and Neil, this is where Ed Glazer gave his talk. And this really shows the sort of influence or the idea that how the influence of urban economics and the type of stuff we all study has come into the UK, because cities are now seen as really, really important, economically, politically, and socially. But there has been relatively little critique of this agenda. There was a really nice paper by Ivan Chirov, or a book chapter by Ivan Chirov, but that was related to the global south. And this makes me question it. It makes me wonder, is this inclusive growth in cities agenda, is it actually helping us achieve something? Or is it simply a buzzword? You know, and I know there have been critiques labeled at things like sustainable development in the past. But the danger of something like sustainable development or inclusive growth becoming a buzzword is that you use it, it makes you feel better, but it doesn't actually achieve anything. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. There's a paper, Inclusive Growth in Cities, Sympathetic Critique, which is available. It's free to download on the Regional Studies Journal website. And basically what I'm going to talk about is a little bit of history. I'm going to define inclusive growth, talk about the problems of defining it. I'm going to talk about why this is important for cities. And then I'm going to sort of critique the inclusive growth agenda. But I have one important caveat, which is that it's very easy to critique. As academics, we spend a lot of time critiquing policymakers, and it's very easy to do that. But actually, policy is incredibly hard. And I think we need to recognize that as well. So this is Google Trends data for inclusive growth, going back to 2004. And don't worry too much about the scale, but what this basically tells you is how interest in inclusive growth has increased from 2004 up until a couple of months ago. And what you can see is around the sort of time of the crisis, suddenly there became a significant increase in inclusive growth. So 2009, you can see this sort of peak. And inclusive growth became a word which started to be used in the development literature, predominantly, or the development world predominantly. In the UK, we're slightly later. We've come to this slightly later. So you can see the trends start to pick up only sort of the 20, there's some spikes, but it only becomes really, really important as a concept in sort of end of 2015, start of 2016. So we've come to that relatively late, and this is interesting for me. Now the context is this one of inequality and poverty, and of inequality and concern about inequality. There's a sort of debate in the UK about inequality, which gets very confused. So in the very short term, actually, wage inequality hasn't been increasing very much in the UK at all, but we have a big problem of income inequality. And while there's this good news story, I mean, the big change in, I guess, the global economy, certainly since I was an undergraduate, has been the rise of China. And this has meant there have been, by some measures, there's been sort of falls in absolute poverty and inequality between, well, certainly falls in absolute poverty, some falls in inequality between countries. But this disguise, if we look at this overall trend, we're disguising significant bad news. And this is the long-term tendency towards higher inequality within countries. These patterns are mirrored in OECD regions to a certain extent. So we can see that regional inequality within countries has been increasing, most countries, while inequality across the OECD has been falling. So in the US, we have this really troubling picture of wage stagnation since 1979. By some measures, the US median wage in the late 70s is roughly equivalent to the US median wage now. I'm not 100% sure that's true, but it's certainly startling that it could potentially be. In the UK, we've seen very little increase in wages since 2009. We've, of course, seen Thomas Piketty's famous and controversial book. And my colleague, Andres Rodriguez-Poze, talks about this other problem, which is that many of these problems of inequality, and particularly regional inequality, have been associated with many of the populist votes we've seen over the last 5 years or so. Now, the second piece of context I think is important. It's the way that we think about growth and the income distribution. I did this graph, that's why it's not very good. But the dominant model of the income distribution has traditionally been, or growth in the income distribution has been Kuznets. And Kuznets, starting with this idea that inequality would first rise with development, but then it would sort of begin to fall. So you essentially, the model here is that you have a city develops, or a sort of manufacturing heartland develops, people work on the fields, they move to the manufacturing heartland, and in doing so, the first people move, and that increases inequality because you have some people who are on high incomes. And then the second sort of challenge you have is that then, and then the next thing which happens is more people move into the city or move into the manufacturing sector, and inequality begins to fall. This is the sort of basis of the trickle-down theory of economic development. And there's some problems with this, not least is the fact that it's not borne out in any of the data. So we don't know, the data doesn't seem entirely consistent with this view. And there's a really nice sort of econometric school, well, it's a set of econometric papers done by people like Donald Cray, Martin Rebellion, these sort of development economists who talk about, and who basically talk about the fact that while there's probably an overall, there's certainly an overall benefit of growth, actually the growth, different types of growth matters. The composition of growth matters. And so when we use average indicators, such as GDP as a sort of measure of progress, that we're not capturing the sort of subtle distributional outcomes which are happening within countries. So our indicators which we use to focus on GDP, our indicators which we use to measure economic progress, these tend not to capture the sort of inequality of GDP. So we can measure growth well, we can't necessarily see how inclusive it is. And our traditional models which suggest that all you need to do to sort of reduce inequality is sort of grow your economy. These don't seem to bear out. Sometimes they do. There are sort of certainly examples of sort of inclusive growth, the experience of Australia, but many growth spells are not, certainly not inclusive. So, given that background, it was always going to be the case that certain concepts would become important to sort of try and capture the idea that traditional measures of growth were not capturing everything we wanted to. And the first one here is pro-poor growth, or one of the first ones I'm going to talk about is pro-poor growth. So this is Martin Rebellion. I can't see the date, but sort of, earlier period. He says that almost everyone in the development community, it's 2004, almost everyone in the development community is talking about pro-poor growth. We have this sort of idea that pro-poor growth has become this buzzword. It's become something which people are interested in, and it's becoming the sort of thing which policymakers are putting on their strategy documents and making policy about. Now, this was a dual agenda. So if you read the literature on pro-poor growth, it was both a sort of technical agenda in that they were trying to establish new metrics that could help them understand how growth could reduce poverty, but it was also political. And I'll come back to the significance here, because it was partly a reaction to the Washington Consensus. It was a reaction to the idea that actually these growth at all cost policies had somehow led people at the bottom of the income distribution to lose out. So pro-poor growth of these sort of dual aims. And it sort of wasn't quite as catchy. Pro-poor is like you're focusing on poverty. It's about pictures of sort of children not doing very well, children in rags. And it's gradually been overtaken by the notion of inclusive growth. So you can see that the red line here is searches for pro-poor growth. The blue line is searches for inclusive growth. And you can see that inclusive growth is sort of really overtaken. Even back to, this goes back nicely to when Martin Ravalian made his quote about pro-poor growth is really significant. And this raises challenges for us about making sure that inclusive growth, if we do think it's a good thing, making sure that it does have some sort of meaningful change. And also it helps us to think about inclusive growth as not necessarily, it helps us to think about policy as being about fads and about phases as much as it is about sort of concepts which last. So the question is, what is inclusive growth? And some of you guys may know what this is in front of you. It is a Rorschach test. And a Rorschach test is an ink blot test. It's a psychological test. And the idea here is that you will look at it, people look at it, and they will think, you will essentially project your own emotions or your own feelings onto this. So for me, this looks like a bat. For other people, it looks like something, a sparrow. For other people, it looks like something completely different. But the idea is that you project your own feelings onto it. And my argument here is that inclusive growth has this sort of quality. People think about inclusive growth according to their own prior prejudices. So this is the, let's look at how it has been applied by policymakers. This is Europe 2020, so this goes right back to 2010. And they had the notion that inclusive growth was fostering a high employment economy, delivering social and territorial cohesion. Now, for those of you who've ever studied European policy, this is kind of similar to what they were trying to do with the Lisbon Agenda, which was focused on a knowledge-based economy, which delivered cohesion and economic performance at the same time. And they do this through skills, poverty, fighting poverty, training in social protection systems, and building a cohesive society. So, there's a question here. Inclusive growth makes it is used in this document, but it doesn't necessarily move us on from the Lisbon Agenda 10 years before. What other definitions have we got? The Scots were quite early to this. They talk about the idea that it is, growth which combines increase in prosperity with greater equity. The World Economic Forum talk about something slightly different. They talk about output growth that is sustained over decades. But there's a sort of slightly different feature here. And the RSA, the Inclusive Growth Commission here, enabling as many people as possible to contribute to and benefit from growth, which is sort of simple and clear and relatively focused. So at the heart of these definitions, there tend to be two things: growth and inclusion. But it's quite difficult to operationalize a strategy which is so sort of simple and so focused. So this is from a city in the north of England called Leeds, and Leeds have, I look like I'm being critical about Leeds here, but actually Leeds have been sort of to the forefront of pushing the notion of inclusive growth. So, it feels unfair to be critical. And they suggest inclusive growth is about ensuring all people and communities can benefit, tackling inequality, supporting all sections of our society into good jobs, supporting people to live healthy and active lives, sport, regenerating neighborhoods, low carbon, raising skill levels and productivity. And the problem here is that while you have this sort of first part of the definition, which seems to reflect that of the RSA, the latter parts of it go way beyond that. It sort of sprawls. And this is partly driven by, the guys at Leeds. These are the sort of things they had power over. And these are the sort of things which their politicians wanted to, who the sort of, who the sort of civil servants were trying to sort of, please. These are the sort of things they're interested in. And, local policy making is complex. People have agendas. There are already established policy agendas going on. So one of the problems here is that when you take this simple concept and then you apply it to real life, it becomes difficult, because you start off with growth and inclusion. Low carbon sort of seems to be pretty clearly there. Good job skills, pretty clearly there. Healthy and active lives feels much more about inclusion. I'm not sure how you link that to growth. Similarly, sport. And so you end up with this sort of simple definition, which starts to sprawl. So what's happened in terms of the inclusive growth in cities agenda? I mean, I could have put up a similar list of sort of research agendas across the world, ADB, anywhere, sort of across. There's been lots of work in sort of East Asia, in particular. India is sort of huge, sort of focus on inclusive growth. I'm less sure about sort of Latin America. Perhaps Igor could tell us later. We've seen this big rise in research on inclusive growth. And in the UK, the policy agenda has moved incredibly quickly. So this is the Leeds had an inclusive growth strategy. These were the guys who were sort of first. That was September of last year. Then this is Newcastle and Derby. That was October. They had some sort of work on inclusive growth. Sheffield City region, sort of September of last year. Bristol, I can't remember when this was. They were going to have an inclusive growth strategy. West Midlands have got an inclusive growth strategy. And even today, there was another announcement about the sort of inclusive growth framework, which was going to be used in the West Midlands. And these are all good things. I don't want to sort of seem churlish about the idea that, policymakers are necessarily being interested in inclusive growth, but we need to sort of think about them in a bit more detail. So why are policymakers interested in inclusive growth in cities? I think, clearly cities are increasingly important economic and political actors. And at the moment, there is dissatisfaction, of course, with the approach of national policymakers. This is clear in the United States. If you look in the United States, where we have cities which voted for one party and rural areas who voted somewhere else. And if we look in Europe, so I have some forthcoming work, hopefully forthcoming work, where we show that people in cities increasingly trust politicians, people in the countryside increasingly don't trust politicians. But also cities are a good scale to look at poverty and inequality, because many of the most stark contrasts we look at are at a city level. But there's also a very strong public policy rationale for focusing on inclusive growth at a city level. So Ivan Chirok, in his paper with Ivan Chirok's in South Africa, looks lots at the sort of Southern African focus, or Sub-Saharan African focus here. He suggests that one of the great things about sort of urban approaches is that you can have new policies which trial them, or you can trial new policies and then other areas can sort of try them out if they work. You can bring together local actors. You can provide policies which are specifically tailored for the specific local context. So earlier I suggested that much of the econometric evidence suggests that the composition or the type of growth matters. And actually it's really important that we have a local approach, because we can take into account this sort of specific local composition of growth. And there's also some sort of political strengths of this wave of interest. So it's acceptable politically. It's a positive way of thinking about inequality. Pro-poor growth was not so useful in the sense that it just felt exactly like anti-poverty strategies. It felt like the same sort of thing we've been doing before. Whereas inclusive growth is like a positive way of thinking about inequality, of thinking about poverty. For some, so my colleague Ruth Lupton at Manchester, one of the points she often makes is the fact that social policy and growth are intrinsically linked. So if we have poor quality social policy hinders your economic development, at the same time, if you help people in terms of health, you help people in terms of getting them into the labour market through measures to improve health, then social policy can be an important part of growth. But the other thing is that for a long time, there have been some famous books on Bartik's book on who gains from local economic development. But we tended not to think about economic development and who it benefits, at least in the sort of urban and regional economic development strategy. So what's the problem? So that's why it's so what I've told you so far is why it comes about, why, what the sort of the lineage was, the roots of inclusive growth. And I've told you a little bit about what I think is good about this agenda. What is good about the inclusive growth and citizen agenda? But now I'm just going to say about three policies, three areas I think are really significant problems with this agenda, which we really need to address. And the first I've kind of alluded to is this fuzziness. Here's a paper from the World Bank and a paper from the OECD Health Group. Inclusive growth and health and inclusive green growth. And the problem with inclusive growth as an agenda, or one of the problems, is that you don't really know, it means many things to many people. So I suggested that it was a Rorschach test, an ink blot test. And this is potentially problematic. So there's a fantastic and famous paper by Anne Markussen, where she talks about fuzzy concepts. So researchers talk about one concept, and then policymakers may actually be targeting something entirely different. And I think it's pretty clear that inclusive growth is falling into this concept. It's falling into this sort of this category. It's become a fuzzy concept which sprawls into areas such as health, such as environment, sport, and this may or may not be a good thing, but it's potentially sort of fairly problematic. And it's problematic for, I'll talk more about why it's problematic in a moment. But there's a few areas in which it's sort of, it's particularly fuzzy. First of all is what is included in the notion of inclusive growth. Are we talking about sport, or are we talking simply, should sport be included in the definition of inclusive growth? My view is probably not. Health, probably not either. Most definitions, lots of definitions now include the environment. And there's an element of people projecting their own powers or their own interests onto it. Because I tend to do work in labour, so I tend to think that actually, it should mostly be about employment. But many of my colleagues would completely disagree with that. Second question is about whether it should be about inequality or poverty. Now, the critique here is that if you focus on inequality, if you focus on the inclusion for everyone, you might be distracting attention away from the poorest. If you're raising incomes for the median income, that's a good thing, but not if you could have been raising incomes for people at the very bottom of the income distribution. But then, if you are using inclusive growth to focus on the very poorest, why don't you just focus on them specifically? And why don't you be honest and upfront about it and just say you have an anti-poverty strategy? And these sort of definitions matter. So to give you an example, I already talked about China's entry into the world economy. This reduced poverty by 500 million people, but it also increased inequality significantly. So we have to, are we happy with inclusive growth if it leads to inequality, even if it comes with a massive reduction in poverty? And there's this other question, which is really important for those of us who do sort of urban and regional work, which is about spatial scale. So is inclusive growth, so the European Commission, much of their work on inclusive growth focuses on regions, making sure that the lagging regions do better than the regions, or catch up with the richer regions. But actually for many other people, many of the cities I'm focused on, they're interested in bringing up their most disadvantaged residents. The Mayor of London is interested in his poorest neighbourhoods or his poorest residents. He doesn't care about what's going on in Bristol, or he doesn't care at all about what's going on in other parts of the UK, even if those are sort of lagging areas. Now, of course, there's a defence, which is that this fuzziness actually is part of the strength of inclusive growth. And there's an element of truth here. People can unify around the idea of inclusive growth, even if they couldn't unify around the idea of pro-poor growth or an anti-poverty strategy or simply tackling inequality. And so inclusive growth is politically acceptable simply because partly because it is fuzzy. It makes it useful and acceptable. And the argument here, and I think there's some truth here, is that it doesn't need to change everything, it just needs to change something. But there is a counter argument as well. And this is the target, if we think about the best examples of anti-poverty strategies, they tend to be targeted because that helps you focus resources on the best levers to achieve your goals. That helps, measurement helps keep people honest and prevents sort of misuse by policymakers. It prevents you just putting inclusive growth on on any old strategy. And measurement really focuses policy agendas. To give you an example here, in the UK, the new Labour government of the 2000s, they had a series of social policy goals, metrics, which they were targeting. And Tony Blair, who's the then Prime Minister, was really focused on these goals. And basically, we hit most of them. Well, I think they hit all. I have colleagues here who've done work and suggest that almost all of these targets were hit. Now, there's a problem here, because there were lots of targets which they should have been aiming for as well, which they didn't hit. So they reduced child poverty, but they increased in-work poverty. But you know, the fact is that the metrics we set should and often do matter. And also, if you have clear metrics, it reduces the problem that people just call any old thing an inclusive growth strategy. So the second agenda, or the second problem here, is about what works. What works in making growth inclusive? So this is one of the critiques which Ivan Chirok suggests, is that we really don't have a clear framework for how policymakers should make growth inclusive. And this isn't just a problem in somewhere like the UK or across the OECD. This is a problem whenever we use inclusive growth. So, you know, in the developing world, where there's been a much longer focus on inclusive growth, despite a wide range of studies, we still don't know that much about what the correct sort of policy mix is. In a country like the UK, I mean, we have no idea. You know, we have really no idea what the correct policy mix is. We do have some idea, but it tends to be the sort of national level levers which we have good policy on. And again, there's a sort of strong defense against this critique, which is that frameworks are being developed. You know, the inclusive growth analysis unit at the University of Manchester is doing some work. You know, there's great stuff, like there's a fantastic book by Benner and Chris Benner and Manuel Pastor in the US, which is sort of setting out how you might go about sort of inclusive, you know, achieving a form of inclusive growth, although they steer clear of the buzzword. And so frameworks are being developed. So maybe this will sort of, maybe this critique will be less valuable soon, but at the moment it certainly looks like policy is overtaking the evidence. It's certainly overtaking the evidence. But I guess the third critique, and my final critique is probably the most severe here, right? Which is that one of the dangers of the inclusive growth agenda, as it has been taken up enthusiastically by cities, partly because they're dissatisfied with national government. So, you know, if you're Bill de Blasio in New York and you have this sort of idea you're sort of going to address inequality, you know, part of that is because you're not satisfied with or you don't believe that Donald Trump is going to do much about it, or that a good partner. But part of the problem here is that, you know, this idea that local government should somehow be solving these massive issues around income distribution, around the sort of economic development. You know, they have some powers, but they really are not holding the big sticks. They do not have power over the major levers. So remember earlier on when I was talking about pro-poor growth, I suggested that pro-poor growth was partly a reaction to the Washington Consensus, and the idea that the Washington Consensus had meant that we had reduced public spending, and it meant that people were sort of dissatisfied with strategies, anti-poverty strategies, in particular that we weren't able to redistribute money through the tax system to help poor people become less poor. And inclusive growth has kind of become popular in the developed world in a similar period. So in the UK, local government finances have been decimated. I mean, some local authorities have lost 40, 50% of their budget, I think. And it's not necessarily a coincidence that inclusive growth has become a big, sort of increasingly popular at the same time as this. You know, cities don't have any of the big sticks here. And actually, you know, the other problem here is that much of what's going on at the city level is determined by these enormous sort of, I guess, these national trends or these international trends. You know, the rise of China has had, you know, it's been enormously positive, of course, but it has had some sort of significant negative effects for certain groups in certain cities. And cities really face these sort of challenges. You know, they really have to face these challenges, and they need more support from national government rather than less. So there's a danger that this is a sort of process of cities trying to do what they can, but the buck being passed by national government. And indeed, there's there's another challenge here, which is that we focus on inclusive growth, and the idea is that we can somehow address challenges of inclusion and redistribution, and inclusion and poverty and inequality. We can somehow do it in this magic inclusive growth way, rather than simply having to make some hard choices and say that, you know, we need to redistribute income, we need to tax people who are on higher incomes, or tax companies on, you know, to tax some of our sort of big companies more, and, you know, provide the money to people on lower income. If we look at, you know, inclusive growth looks very different in an economy, you know, an economy such as India, to it looks good in an economy such as Denmark, where they perhaps have less need for it. And these big economic forces which are driving inclusive growth. So if we look at sort of the OECD, and we look at the countries where they have had spells of inclusive growth, you know, if we look at Australia, you know, they had a period of very strong, very inclusive growth in the sort of late 2000s, early 2010s, and a lot of this was driven by a mining boom. And cities don't have any powers over whether they have a mining boom or not. They have relatively few powers over whether they have resources and whether sort of the Chinese want to buy into those resources. So there's this sort of danger that it becomes a sort of fig leaf. A, it's sort of passing the baton to local government, and B, it's making us sort of forget about these sort of big, making us forget about these big trends which are actually driving the income distribution in cities. Now, what I don't want to say is that any of this means that inclusive growth is sort of useless, and local areas clearly do have some important powers. But the problem is that there's some sort of big claims being made about the merits of inclusive growth, certainly in sort of UK cities, and about what cities can achieve. So, Igor, I think I'm sort of running slightly over what I said. But in summary, just to sort of, you know, give you an outline of my argument today. So, inclusive growth has become a massive agenda. It's become the buzzword in terms of economic development in the UK and much of the OECD, and in many other countries as well. And it has been focused increasingly on cities. And this is problematic. I call this the inclusive growth in cities agenda, shorthand. And I think it is sort of, you know, it leads to, there are some things we need to be really concerned about. Part of this is about, you know, how we can make growth inclusive. The frameworks are only recently being developed. We're only starting to learn what works. You know, I had a chat with one of the big UK cities recently, where we talked about, you know, what they could possibly do around inclusive growth. And the answer is, you know, that we have some idea, but we really don't have a sort of strong evidence base. Not yet, at least. There's a second challenge, which is that it's becoming fuzzy and it's becoming sort of imprecise. So it risks becoming something of a buzzword. And this final, you know, challenge here is that we need to be really realistic about this, about what can actually be achieved. Local governments, you know, one interpretation of inclusive growth is that it will help regional economies grow, in lagging regional economies grow. This is partly what the Europe 2020 agenda seems to be about. Now, the challenge here is that we have been trying really hard to do this anyway. Sometimes we've succeeded, sometimes we've failed, but it's not, you know, it's proven to be a very difficult thing to do, to drive up growth in lagging regions. So actually, even if local government had the powers to do this, they had the powers to do whatever they wanted, it would still be difficult for them to do it. The powers, I put powers here, I mean, probably more important is the financing. But I just want to end on this point that this is the critique of, well, this is my critique of inclusive growth. And, you know, I think there's some really problematic elements of this current agenda. But what I don't want to suggest is that inclusive growth is somehow worthless, because it is definitely better than not thinking about redistribution at all. Local government can do something, and even if it can be used, even if it does become a buzzword, if it achieves a small amount of change, that's better than nothing. And my colleague Anne Green always makes this point to me. So I've sort of referenced her, although she's not put it in writing yet. But she suggests that even if you have, you know, if inclusive growth does at least shape policies in some way to ensure that they consider distribution, then it will have been worth doing. And while inclusive growth, the inclusive growth cities agenda is, you know, really flawed, it's not without merit. It's still better than the alternative. So there you go. Thank you very much. Igor.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you very much for your really great presentation. And now we have time to questions. So please, if you have questions, you can unmute your microphone or you can type in the chat. For now, Donna has questions. Donna, do you want to do it aloud? You can just unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me, Igor?
Hi.
Can you hear me all right?
Yeah.
Okay. Neil, can you hear me? It's Donna Carmichael.
Hi, Donna.
Hi, how are you? Thank you for a great presentation. I have about 3 pages of questions, so I'm gonna start with one, and hopefully maybe I can get another 1 or 2 in. You early on in the presentation, you mentioned that inclusive growth is often viewed as a placebo for policymakers. You know, in these times of just soaring inequality, it is also not a bit of a placebo for the 1%. You know, the people who hold the vast majority of wealth, of economic wealth, either through income or you know, possession of assets and wealth. Is it not also probably, perhaps more importantly, a bit of a red herring in some ways, because these people are getting very, very nervous about the rising inequality? Not that there's any real interest in you know, looking at redistribution, but the 1%, are they not worried about the 99% rising up? And is that why inclusive growth is thrown around as a fancy term for trying to address inequality?
Yeah, so I probably wouldn't be quite so cynical. So look, I mean, there's two things there. The first is sort of, you know, is it a placebo for the 1%? You know, I think it's interesting. There's a MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth. There's, you know, the World Economic Forum have been very interested in inclusive growth. And I think to a certain extent, yeah, I think people are concerned. But I think there's also, you know, I think to a certain extent, I think you're right that the 1% probably are, you know, I don't tend to use the terms 1% because I don't, you know, I do sort of, yeah, I don't tend to sort of work in that. That tends to be the sort of thing sociologists say. But the sort of, you know, the very affluent, I guess, you know, I think there is genuine concern. I mean, you can be in the global 1% if you own a house in London. And I think, you know, so I think there's you know, the 1% is very big, but I think there is definitely a concern amongst people who are in the, I guess, policy world. So one of the things which is interesting here is how much this is driven by policymakers. So, you know, if you work for the World Economic Forum, or if you work for Leeds City Council, and you're looking for something which you can do as a sort of, not a placebo or not a red herring, but like a Trojan horse to try and get some sort of, to try and get a policy agenda off the ground. And you're like, well, look, we have a load of people here we have a load of people like my Peter Manions I started with, who are essentially they're not going to touch anything which talks about inequality. They're not going to touch anything which talks about poverty. So what I'm going to do is give them inclusive growth. And this is going to be like a Trojan horse for a series of policies which are, I guess, positive in some way. And I really want to hope that that's true to a certain degree. Whether it's going to do enough to stop some of the sort of discontent about inequality, I'm not so clear on. I don't know whether it's going to have anything like the effect to address any of these long-standing inequalities.
Thank you.
Do you want to do another question? We have here, Jean Paul wants to do a question. Jean Paul, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, I have a couple of questions as well. The first one is, well, first of all, thank you for your lecture. And the first one is, what would you say to critics, especially, I'm from Brazil, and especially now we are in election time, and we have some politicians from the right wing saying that, well, inequality is not really a problem, that we should just fight poverty, and that's it. So what would you say to this kind of critic? And the second one is if you could talk about a little bit about inclusive growth. You mentioned a bit, but the real difference between developed cities and underdeveloped cities, like the city where I'm from, Rio in Brazil, which is an underdeveloped city. So how can we approach this kind of topics in cities like that? And the final one would be, I saw a lecture from Professor Fran Tompkins from the London School, and where she talks about urban inequality, and she says something like, Professor David Harvey also says that we are becoming some sort of like societies of finance and society of executives, and this kind of societies are concentrate the wealth pretty much because we have this kind of businessman and woman that control the finance, and they have impacts on housing markets, and that leads to more segregated cities and segregated space. If you could talk about that a little bit. That's it.
Okay.
Thank you.
So on your first point around, the critics, should we focus on inequality? Why would we focus on inequality? Why would we focus on poverty? So I guess my argument around inequality. So I'm in the sphere of academics. I'm not like, there's sort of good inequality and bad inequality. There's good inequality in the sort of Kuznets sense when your economy is growing. And I think in most countries, we're not looking at that sort of inequality at all. We're looking at the sort of bad sort of inequality, which holds back growth, which leads to these sort of problems of sort of populism, which leads to issues around sort of, rentier capitalism. So that's where I think we are in most countries, certainly in sort of Latin America. And so that might be my first response. My second response would be, my second response would be that it's not inconsistent to focus on inequality and poverty. These are both important things, and you can have some sort of floor targets to bring people up at the bottom, but you still need to worry about people who are sort of below the median. In the UK, the focus has been on the people at the top. Policy has tended to help people at the top. And by the top, I mean the top sort of 40%, I would guess. There's been sort of continual neglect of people at the sort of the bottom. So yeah, so I'd say that, and I'd also say that, one of the best ways of growing your economy in the context of inequality is to bring people who are not particularly productive into the sort of labor force, to make them more productive and give them better jobs. And that the positive spin on inclusive growth would be to do that. Second point around developing and developed world and Rio. So look, I have a confession to make, which is that I've not done enough work on, I've never done any work on Latin America. But you can see, if you read the literature on India, for example, you can see the challenges are very different. And actually, this is one of the big strengths behind a local approach. So if you look locally, you can have an approach with, one of the things, so I was actually talking about this with some Indian policymakers on Wednesday, and some of them were from, they were talking about the issues faced in Mumbai and the issues faced in other parts of India. And in Mumbai, they have some of the problems we have in London of high rental prices, insecure labor even for sort of, middle class people. And these are very different from the problems you have somewhere else in India. So one of the things I would suggest is that the rationale for the local approach helps to break down these artificial divides. So I think the division between the sort of developed and the developing world is increasingly breaking down in the same way that, we're starting to see that within countries there is a sort of hierarchy of development. China's the, great example here. Eastern seaboard very rich, Western periphery still very, very poor. And I'm not going to say it's completely broken down, but it's sort of breaking down to a certain point. And your final point about Fran, Fran Tonkis. So Fran, I got interested in inequality actually because of Fran Tonkis, because I did her courses, which I would strongly recommend. And I mean, you know, I'm not a sociologist. I do work in economic geography or urban econ. So these notions around sort of finance and, you know, financiers and changing the economy, I don't know too much about them. The one thing I would say though is that there is definitely a sort of skills divide, and that is what's driving a lot of what's going on in the West. Is this divide between people with high skilled levels and people with low skilled levels, and the fact that the economy is benefiting one group and not benefiting the others. And that's what I think is driving many of our patterns. That's one of the things I learned off Fran. So that's not a convincing answer, but we can all agree that it works very good.
Okay, so thank you, Professor Leo. Now we're moving to another question made by Patricia Andrade from Brazil. I'm reading her question because she's without microphone. Well, she said, first of all, thank you very much for the very good presentation. And then she said that on your critical number 3, you say that inclusive growth has become popular as austerity. But do you think that austerity has more political support than an inclusive growth?
I think that's a great question. I'm stumped.
Trick question.
I mean, I guess it depends, right? In the UK, inclusive growth isn't as big as austerity. Okay, so first of all, I would say that most people don't care much about either. You know, you always have to remember that we are in a bubble, in that we care about these issues. In the UK, I guess, you know, half of the population doesn't, you know, all they care about is Manchester United or, you know, what's on TV that day. They have perfectly healthy, sane interests which are not involved in economic policy. And then in the UK, I'd say it really depends. It really depends. I think there, you know, what's going to be interesting, you know, I'm not going to answer the question. But what I'm going to say is that it's going to be interesting to see what happens next. You know, does inclusive growth stay as a, does it stay as a sort of important concept, or does it sort of decline? And I think the same, you know, the same is true for austerity, whether austerity is going to, you know, in 10 years' time, is austerity going to be seen as a sort of failed experiment? You know, I think it's probably, you know, it's certainly gone too far. Is it going to be seen as a failed experiment, or is it going to be seen as something, you know, as something else? So I'm not answering that question. It's too good.
Okay, thank you. So now, Donna, you have one more question, right?
Right. If I may, I want to monopolize the conversation here. So Neil, I just want to challenge the whole concept of growth, as you know, it's a fundamental tenet of neoliberal capitalism. And I think you mentioned one of the issues early on in your presentation about the composition of growth, and I think that's incredibly important. If you look at the impact of austerity and inequality, it's highly gendered, it's highly racialized, it impacts you know, older people more than younger people, and it impacts positively kind of that class-based view of you know, differential impact. You know, I find it, and I'm a little cynical. I spent a week with David Harvey in an immersive program a few weeks ago in New York, so I'm a little cynical. But I just want to ask you about the composition of growth and how inclusive growth can address the differential impact of inequality, you know, even the spatial impact, as Danny Dorling talks about a lot. You know, how can it possibly grapple with those differential impacts?
So first, the defense for growth. So look, in an ideal world, we would be able to achieve the sort of things like improvements in living standards, you know, better healthcare, longer lifespan, all of that sort of stuff. It would be great if we could achieve that in some way which didn't rely on growth, and often we can, and you know, sometimes we can, but actually if you stick a line through GDP and most measures of things we care about, GDP is not a bad, you know, explainer. The exception is the United States. You know, so if you look at things like, you know, life expectancy, you know, happiness, lots of, happiness is kind of a funny one, but lots of these things, growth does matter to a certain degree. And it would be lovely if it completely didn't, and we could work out the sort of policy arrangements where we didn't have to worry about growth, and maybe we will have to. But at the moment, I still think growth is probably the best way of improving living standards, with some big caveats. And then you sort of also, your second thing you were sort of referring to is, is inclusive growth going to have that much of an effect? Is it going to address the sort of Dawling type inequalities? I don't think so. Part of the point of this paper is to show that inclusive growth is, it's becoming a useful technocrat, useful buzzword, but it's probably not going to have the same sort of, it's not going to achieve as much as other buzzwords have done in the past. There's actually an interesting, an interesting comparison with social exclusion. So social exclusion was a term which was really popular in the UK under the Blair government, to refer to that again. And it actually sort of, I think it probably had a sort of significant impact on public policy, partly because it was basically put right at the heart of central government, that social exclusion mattered. And social exclusion was like a concept where it was like a broad concept of sort of poverty. So, the idea was that if you were poor, you were excluded from lots of different aspects of life. So employment, but also social life, some things about health, etc. And that was all put into this concept of social exclusion. And they measured it. There was a unit right in the heart of government working on social exclusion, and this was like and it actually achieved some positive change. Inclusive growth, there are some moves to sort of create units and stuff like that. It doesn't seem to me quite as influential yet. Maybe that's good and maybe that's bad. Maybe it's undercooked, the idea of inclusive growth. The social exclusion is probably a sort of clearer concept.
Okay,
Thank you.
So John, do you mind if we give the word to Nurlan first, because you already made one question and Nurlan has a first one? Okay, so thank you. So Nurlan, can you use your mic?
Yes.
So go ahead.
Thank you for the presentation and thank you for organizing it. What I wanted to tell and ask was, generally before that, I want to tell that through reading even the article, like the paper, I faced with some similarities that I did a research 1 month ago on the topic of defining social economy, and it's like the approach of mine was something similar, because social economy is also facing similar fate, and in a policy debate they are misusing it very frequently, and through characteristical analysis I try to define what is it and so on. But in the end, like after it's already 1 month it's published, and when I was reading it after a while, I just started to think maybe it's quite idealistic to think of a very inclusive growth in the future in the world, and maybe we need to make a realistic expectations towards the future so that people also understand, and rather than being like dreamers we can be like realists, because like it's really nice, even like the ideas that I propose in the research for the social economy, which includes social cohesion and so on, so sustainable development, but it seems at the moment abstract. But I would like to ask, how much confidence do you have in the future of inclusive growth and generally, like, let's say, social economy? Because inclusive growth is included in social economy, because social economy is the way how economies perform to enable these types of growths.
Yeah, so social economy is interesting because it's one of those things which I know that I like it, but I don't really know what it means. You see what I mean? It just sounds good, but I'm not. So look, I mean, I'll take your point. I guess prospects for inclusive growth as so my guess is that obviously I kind of hope that inclusive growth has a fair lifespan, but you can already see people shifting to alternative concepts sometimes. So there's a big concern. So for example, we were trying to see whether we could set up an inclusive growth research center. And one of the major pieces of feedback we had from people was, don't call it an inclusive growth center, because in 10 years time, that's going to sound like, you know, it's going to sound as dated as those skinny jeans you're wearing now, you know? It's just a sort of piece of fashion which is going to go out of fashion. And I think, you know, there's a danger that inclusive growth could go that way, unless there's some sort of big event. So sustainable development always strikes me as an interesting concept, because, you know, they actually, you know, it was clearly defined, and then they had a sort of, you know, while it's clearly flawed, and I don't want to sort of, you know, there's all sorts of limitations with the concept of sustainable development, it has lingered on for quite a long time. You know, I was taught it when I was at uni, and that was sort of 15 or more, 18 years ago. So it's a sort of, you know, I think it remains to be seen whether inclusive growth is going to persist. I don't have a strong opinion. My guess, if I had to put a bet on, we could put a bet on, I reckon inclusive growth is still going to be used by policymakers in 5 years, but not in 10. I don't know if you disagree with that.
I wouldn't say like if I would disagree or whatsoever, but let's see how the world will be shaped, because technological advancement is far faster than we think it is. So it has a huge influence.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, inclusive growth is going to be, yeah, even more important in 10 years.
Thank you.
Okay, so João, and if anyone else has a question, please let us know, because time is almost over.
Okay, I have two more questions. It's aligned with what Donna was asking about the composition of growth, and what do you think about industrial policy nowadays? Because we know that during the golden age of capitalism, the industry was kind of the power force that was leading to jobs, employment, and growth itself. So what do you think is the role of industrial policy nowadays within the cities, talking about cities? And the second one is, what do you think about this ideology of competitive cities around the world, which is kind of related to really neoliberalism and you know, the idea that cities have to themselves resolve their problems, and they can put themselves into global context and into competitive place in the world. So like cities in my country, like São Paulo and Rio, they have to put themselves to the world, and there's no really place to the national government.
Okay.
Just two questions.
Yeah, so on your first point on industrial policy, I did a report on this last year. So we looked at, so, you know, I think the idea that we need to intervene more in the, you know, that some form of industrial policy is necessary. I think that's okay. I think that's a good one. I still think we have this problem that we don't quite know what we're doing. And I think there's been actually long-term, there has been an underinvestment in many countries in the sort of economic development policy making, which would allow us to be a little bit cleverer on that. You know, not all countries, but I think we definitely, and I think that's potentially going to be a big area, potentially a big and sort of important area, and how we start thinking about industrial policy, which is particularly benefiting places and people in those places which are left behind. You know, if you look at the examples of, I mean, there's a wonderful book, Janesville, about Janesville in Wisconsin, and what happens when a factory closes down. And you know, one of the things which this book illustrated for me was actually how most local government doesn't have very much, they don't have very big sticks to try and do anything about it, and how we will never of course have any magic bullets, but how actually we don't have loads of good ideas to stop that sort of thing happening beyond coping with it. So I think industrial policies, you know, some form of industrial policy, if we're a bit better at it, is really important. And this is because we do it anyway. You know, we have industrial, you know, most countries have some form of industrial policy. The US, the UK, the sort of, you know, neoliberal not neoliberal, the sort of the countries which use the sort of neoclassical type, or still very influenced by the sort of neoclassical type models in this area. Industrial policy, we have them, we just don't recognize them. We invest loads of money in the UK and in research in London and the Southeast, and we don't see that as being part of our industrial policy, whereas actually what it's doing is benefiting certain people in certain places. Now, your second question about competitive cities, I have to be a tiny bit careful here because I know quite a few people who are working on the World Bank's competitive cities program. So I'm going to be a little bit careful. I mean, I would say that the sort of idea of competitiveness and the idea that cities should be trying to sort of aim for competitiveness, I'm not a huge fan. I don't really see what it's sort of, what we're going at. And it doesn't seem to me to be particularly, one of the strengths of, it doesn't seem to me to be particularly well targeted the problems many cities have, frankly. I don't think that this sort of competitive cities type strategy, I'm not a big fan, but I'd be, be willing to be convinced.
No more questions? So I want to thank you, Professor Lee, for your great presentation here. Thank you for accepting our invitation and for your availability to be here with us. It was a great opportunity to our working group. And I want to thank everybody for being here, for the questions. We had a great discussion.
Well, thank you very much for organizing it. I should say before we finish, if anyone's sort of particularly interested in this area and has more questions, they can always email me or send them by Twitter.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor. And our next webinar will be with Professor Alessandra Fagian. Please stay tuned to our Facebook page, our page at YSD to next events. Everyone is invited to be part of our group to help us and to organize sessions, webinar series, or side events. So be part of the group. It's open to everyone. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, guys.
Bye.
Thank you.